3 years of beatings and abuse, until a cowboy walked through the door. She had learned to stay quiet. 3 long years of pain had taught her that silence was her only shield. Every word spoken, every movement made too quickly, could invite another burst of anger. The fear had become a constant companion, sitting with her in every corner of the small house she had come to see as a cage. She barely recognized the woman she had been before, the one who laughed freely, whose eyes sparkled with hope. That person seemed like a stranger now, a memory buried under bruises, tears, and whispered apologies. The mornings were the hardest. Even the sunlight that filtered through the dusty windows felt like a spotlight on her mistakes, as though the world itself was watching her fail. She would wake to the sound of heavy footsteps in a low voice, grumbling about chores undone, mistakes made, things she could never get right no matter how hard she tried. Each day began with a ritual of fear, flinching at sharp words, shrinking from anger she couldn't predict, counting the hours until the day ended without incident. Sometimes she would lie still in bed pretending to sleep even when the pain was fresh, hoping to avoid attention. No one outside seemed to notice her suffering. Neighbors passed by without a glance. Friends had long stopped visiting. And family, she had none she could turn to. It was as though her world had narrowed to the walls of that small home in the shadow of the man who ruled it with fists and shouts. Every plan she tried to make for escape had ended in failure or punishment. Even the smallest hope had been punished, leaving her scared of dreaming too big, scared of wanting anything at all. Yet even in the depths of fear, there were fleeting moments when she remembered life before the pain. She remembered mornings in the sun, the smell of freshly baked bread, the sound of laughter echoing through rooms. She remembered the sense of freedom, of choosing her own path, even if it was only in small ways. Those memories were dangerous, she knew. They made her ache for what she had lost, for a life that felt impossible now. Still, they were the only sparks that kept her heart from turning completely cold. The days were long, filled with endless chores and the constant threat of violence. She would clean the house from floor to ceiling, wash clothes until her hands were raw, and cook meals that were eaten with little gratitude. A wrong look, a delayed response, or even a whispered word could turn into an eruption of anger. She had learned to predict the patterns, to step lightly, to avoid the moments that triggered his rage. It was like walking through a minefield, never knowing which step would set off an explosion. At night, when the house finally grew quiet, she would retreat to the small corner she had claimed as her own. Sometimes she would cry until her pillow was soaked, releasing the fear and pain that had built up during the day. Other nights, she would stare at the ceiling, counting the cracks, thinking of ways she might escape, thinking of a life where she could breathe freely. But those plans always felt too dangerous, too impossible. Fear was stronger than hope, and the shadow of him loomed over every thought. Despite the suffering, she never stopped noticing the small details that reminded her she was still alive. The sound of birds outside the window in the morning, the warmth of sunlight on her skin, the faint smell of wildflowers carried in through the open door. These small things were like whispers of another world, a world that existed beyond the pain, a world she longed to touch again. She clung to these moments quietly, letting them sustain her when the weight of abuse threatened to crush her spirit completely. She had no one to talk to. The walls of the house were witnesses to everything, silent and unyielding. Sometimes she would speak to herself, soft words whispered in the dark, to remind herself she was still there, still human. She repeated the little truths she could hold on to. I am still here. I am still me. I deserve safety. I deserve peace. Saying them aloud was an act of courage, even if no one else could hear. It was her way of holding on to the part of herself that refused to break. The world outside seemed like a distant dream. She would watch people walking past the house from behind curtains, imagining their lives, their freedom. She envied them quietly, wishing she could step outside and feel the wind on her face, the grass beneath her feet. But every time she thought about it, the fear came back. The fear of anger, of punishment, of being caught. It was easier to stay invisible, to blend into the shadows, to let her life pass quietly while the days dragged on. And then there were the moments that were harder to bear than the beatings themselves. The moments when she realized how alone she truly was. No one came to check if she was okay. No one noticed her bruises or the tears she tried to hide. The world moved on without her, and she felt like a ghost, unseen and unheard. It was a loneliness that cut deeper than any physical pain, a reminder that she had no one to protect her, no one to care for her. Still, she had learned to survive. Each day she found new ways to protect herself, new ways to avoid attention, new ways to hide the bruises that marred her skin. She had become clever in her quiet, finding moments of safety in the smallest corners. She had learned to time her movements perfectly, to predict the moods, to avoid words that might provoke anger. Survival had become an art, one that required constant vigilance and courage she sometimes doubted she had. Her mind wandered to dreams she had long stopped believing in. She imagined a life where she could walk freely, where she could laugh without fear, where she could make choices for herself without consequences. She imagined being safe, loved, and valued. These dreams felt fragile, almost too precious to acknowledge. But she clung to them anyway. They were the threads of hope she had left, the light she could still see through the darkness. One particular evening she sat quietly by the window, looking at the horizon as the sun dipped below the hills. The sky was painted in shades of gold and pink, a beauty she had barely allowed herself to notice for years. For a moment she let herself breathe, let herself imagine walking out into that world. She closed her eyes and pictured herself free, feeling the wind on her face, hearing the sounds of nature without fear. And for the first time in a long time she felt a flicker of courage. But courage alone was not enough. The fear returned quickly, reminding her of reality. The house was still small and confining, the man still full of anger, and her life still filled with danger. Yet that tiny spark of hope had taken root. It was fragile, but it was there, and it refused to be extinguished entirely. She didn't know how, or when, or if she would escape, but she knew she could not give up, not completely. Not yet. As she sat there, lost in thought, a new sound reached her ears, a faint knock at the door. It was quiet at first, almost easy to ignore, but then it came again, deliberate and steady. Her heart raced. Every instinct screamed for her to stay hidden, to pretend she hadn't heard, to avoid attention at all costs. But there was something in the rhythm of the knock, something different from the usual chaos of her life. It was calm, patient, and somehow reassuring. She hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. Who could it be? A neighbor? A stranger? Her fear was immediate and overpowering, but curiosity mixed with that fear, creating a strange tension she had not felt in years. She stayed still, listening, barely daring to breathe. The knock came again, and this time she felt a small spark of something unfamiliar. Hope. That evening, she realized that perhaps life could change. Perhaps there was someone out there who would not hurt her, someone who would see her pain and care. She didn't know who it was yet, or what would happen, but the sound at the door stirred something deep inside her. For the first time in a long time, she imagined the possibility of safety, of help, of a life beyond the walls of her home. She sat by the window long after the knock had stopped, thinking, imagining, hoping. The fear was still there. It always would be, but so was the spark of hope. And in that moment she realized that her story might not be over. That maybe, just maybe, someone could walk through that door and change everything. And somewhere beyond the threshold a presence lingered, unaware of the life it was about to touch. Unaware that a single act of kindness, a single decision, could set in motion a chain of events that would lead to freedom, safety, and a chance to heal. The story of her suffering was not yet finished, but the first threads of hope had begun to weave themselves into the tapestry of her life. The sun finally disappeared behind the hills, leaving the sky dark but full of possibilities. She felt a quiet determination growing within her, fragile but real. She knew that change would not come easily, that danger still loomed, but she also knew that the door had opened, even if just a crack. And sometimes, that was enough to begin a journey that could never be undone. The next morning, the knock from the previous night still echoed in her mind. She had imagined every possible scenario, but fear kept her from opening the door. Every step toward it felt heavy, as if the floor itself were warning her to turn back. She paused, hand trembling over the doorknob, wondering if it was a mistake to hope, if it was dangerous even to imagine safety. But something inside her nudged her forward, a tiny spark that had been asleep for years. When she finally turned the knob and opened the door, she saw him. The cowboy stood there, tall and steady, with a calmness in his eyes that immediately made her feel like she could breathe again. His presence was different from anyone she had ever known. There was no anger, no judgment, only quiet concern. He smiled gently, just a little, and said, "Good morning. I'm sorry if I'm disturbing you."
I just wanted to make sure you're okay.
She froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't used to anyone speaking to her like that. Usually words carried weight, power, or danger, but his voice was soft, steady, and safe. She didn't know how to respond at first. All she could do was nod slightly, afraid that even a wrong word might set off a storm. The cowboy didn't step inside. He respected the boundary, standing a few feet away, giving her space. "I live nearby," he said quietly. "I saw you yesterday when I was passing by." "I just wanted to check if everything is all right." His words were simple, but they carried a weight she hadn't felt in a long time, the weight of someone noticing her, of someone caring. She blinked, unsure if she was allowed to hope. I'm fine," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't the truth. Her voice sounded fragile, almost foreign, even to her. The cowboy nodded, as if he understood that sometimes the truth needed time before it could be spoken. Over the next few days, he kept coming by. Each visit was quiet, respectful, and patient. Sometimes he would bring food, leaving it at the doorstep, knocking gently and waiting. Other times he would help with small chores around the yard, moving quietly without asking for anything in return. He never rushed her, never demanded attention, never forced a conversation. Slowly, ever so slowly, she began to feel safe in his presence. It was strange, this feeling. After years of fear and punishment, trust seemed impossible, but there was something different about him. He didn't expect anything, didn't criticize or threaten. He simply existed as a kind, steady presence. Watching him work, listening to him speak softly, she began to imagine a life where she could live without fear, a life where someone might care for her well-being without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, while he was helping repair the fence near the property, she gathered courage she didn't know she had and spoke. "Why are you helping me?" Her voice trembled, but she had to ask. For years, no one had ever done anything for her without a reason, without expecting control or obedience. The cowboy paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Because everyone deserves kindness," he said simply. "No one should live in fear like this." His words were not just words. They were a promise, a truth she had almost forgotten existed. She wanted to believe him, but the fear inside her was strong. How could someone like him care about someone like her? Days turned into weeks, and small moments began to chip away at the walls she had built around herself. The cowboy never pressured her. He never tried to pry into her life or force her to tell stories she wasn't ready to share. He simply showed her through actions, through patience, through presence, through small acts of kindness, that there was another way to live. One day she caught herself watching him carefully, noticing the gentle way he handled tools, the calmness in his movements, the quiet strength in his posture. There was no rush in him, no anger or impatience, just presence and a quiet understanding that not everything needed words. Watching him, she began to imagine a future where she could be steady too, where fear didn't rule her life. The more she observed, the more she realized that safety didn't always have to come with control. For years, her life had been filled with punishment, with people dictating every move, every word. But the cowboy's presence was different. It showed her that someone could care about her without demanding obedience. That someone could want her well-being without threatening her freedom. That someone could be there without breaking her spirit. The first time she allowed herself to speak freely, it was a quiet moment while he was fixing the roof of the barn. I'm scared, she admitted, voice barely audible. It was the first time she had admitted fear out loud in years. Her hands shook, and she looked down, unsure if she could survive the vulnerability. The cowboy stopped, setting down his tools. He turned to her and knelt slightly to meet her gaze. It's okay to be scared, he said softly. You've been through so much. Anyone would be scared. But you're not alone anymore. His words were steady, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. The fear didn't vanish, but it felt lighter, like she was finally allowed to carry it instead of being crushed by it. She began to open up in small ways. She told him about her favorite memories as a child. Simple things, like running through fields, baking bread with her mother, or sitting by a river watching the sunset. She didn't tell him about the abuse at first. That part of her was still too raw, too frightening to voice. But through sharing little joys, she felt the first flickers of trust, the first sparks of connection she had experienced in years. The cowboy never judged her. He never pressed for more than she could give. Instead, he listened, really listened, and that in itself was healing. For someone who had spent 3 years silenced by fear, just being heard was transformative. Each conversation, each shared moment became a brick in a new foundation. A foundation built not on fear, but on trust and respect. He also taught her small skills, things she hadn't done before. He showed her how to care for animals, how to mend fences, how to handle tools safely. Each lesson was practical, but also symbolic. He was showing her that she could take care of herself, that she could learn, grow, and rebuild strength she thought was lost forever. The tasks were simple, but each completed chore gave her confidence, a tiny reminder that she had power in her life again. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, she sat with him outside the house holding a cup of warm tea. She looked at him and realized that she could breathe without fear in this moment. The pain of the past 3 years hadn't disappeared, but it felt distant, like a storm she had survived and now watched from a safe place. She took a deep breath, allowing herself to feel the warmth of the sun, the quiet of the evening, and the presence of someone who cared. It was in these quiet moments that hope began to grow. She realized that her life didn't have to be defined by fear and pain. There was a world beyond the walls of her home, a world where kindness existed, where people could care for one another without expecting control. The cowboy had shown her a glimpse of that world, and she wanted to step into it even if slowly. But fear was still there, lingering in the corners of her mind. The man who had controlled her for so long was unpredictable, and she knew that leaving him could be dangerous. The cowboy understood this, and he never pushed her to act before she was ready. He offered guidance, safety, and reassurance, letting her know that when the time came, she would not have to face the world alone. One afternoon, while helping in the barn, the cowboy spoke gently. I know it's hard to imagine, but you don't have to live like this forever. There's a way out. You can be safe, and you can start over. His words were simple, but they planted a seed she had not dared to nurture before. The idea of freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was something she could work toward, something within reach. She looked at him, eyes wide. I don't know if I can, she admitted, the words barely audible. Fear still gripped her heart, but even as she spoke, she realized that the possibility of escape had never felt more real. For the first time in years, she believed that someone could walk with her towards safety, that she didn't have to face her fears alone.
The cowboy nodded, understanding.
You can, he said simply. And when you're ready, I'll be here to help. You don't have to do this alone. That evening, as she sat by the window again, watching the sky darken into night, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope. The fear was still present, but now it shared space with possibility. She had survived 3 years of pain, and maybe, just maybe, she could survive what came next too. With help, with courage, and with someone by her side who believed in her. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a life where fear didn't rule her. A life where she could walk freely, laugh without hiding, and make choices for herself. The cowboy had shown her that such a life could exist, and that realization made her heart beat a little faster. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if the path to safety would be easy. But she knew one thing for certain: she was no longer completely alone. Someone had seen her pain, and had come without judgment, without expectation, only offering kindness. And that kindness, small as it seemed, was enough to change everything. The day she had been dreading, and secretly hoping for, finally arrived. She woke before sunrise, the sky still dark, and the world quiet. Her heart beat fast, a mixture of fear and anticipation twisting inside her. Today, she would leave the house that had held her captive for 3 long years. She had thought about this moment countless times, each plan carefully rehearsed in her mind. But now, with reality pressing close, fear gripped her with icy hands. The cowboy had come early, as he always did, bringing quiet reassurance rather than loud encouragement. He helped her gather a few essential belongings: a small bag of clothes, some food for the journey, and a few personal items she could carry without drawing attention. He moved with careful efficiency, never rushing, never speaking in a way that would increase her fear. His calm presence was her anchor, steadying her trembling hands and quivering heart. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, his eyes gentle but filled with determination. She nodded, swallowing hard. Her throat felt tight, words trapped behind years of fear. She realized how much she had needed someone to simply ask that question without anger, without judgment, without expectation. For the first time in years, she felt like she mattered. Stepping outside, the morning air felt strange on her skin, cool and fresh after so many days spent inside. She took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs, letting herself feel the world beyond the walls that had imprisoned her. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the wind brushing against her face, was amplified, vivid in a way she had forgotten. The world was alive, and for the first time in years, she could breathe in its life without fear of punishment. The cowboy led the way toward the path he had chosen for their escape, a route that wound through open fields and along hidden trails. He kept a watchful eye on her, alert to every sound, every movement. She followed closely, heart hammering, feet moving carefully over uneven ground. Every step was a mixture of fear and hope, a fragile balance between running from danger and moving toward freedom. As they moved, her mind raced with memories of the past 3 years. Each step was a reminder of the pain, the isolation, the helplessness she had endured. The bruises on her skin, the scars etched into her spirit, all reminded her of the darkness she was leaving behind. But now, with the cowboy beside her, she felt the first stirrings of strength. She realized she had survived everything thrown at her, and that perhaps she was stronger than she had ever known. The path was not easy. They had to navigate through rough terrain, stepping carefully over rocks and branches. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows, but they moved quickly and quietly. Each sound of movement made her flinch, fearing discovery. Every snap of a twig or distant bark of a dog sent shivers through her body. Yet the cowboy's steady presence reassured her. He moved with confidence and purpose, a silent promise that he would protect her, no matter what. As they approached the edge of the property, the danger that had haunted her for years became very real. Her abuser had begun to notice that something was different, that she was no longer as obedient as before. The thought of confrontation sent her pulse racing, fear tightening its grip around her chest. But the cowboy had anticipated this. He slowed, gesturing for her to stay quiet, moving with a careful patience born of experience. They paused behind a line of bushes, hidden from sight. She peered through the branches, heart pounding, and saw him, her abuser, looking around, suspicion written on his face. He was shouting, gesturing wildly, clearly realizing that something was amiss. Fear tried to consume her, but the cowboy placed a firm hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "Stay calm," he whispered. "We can do this." In that moment she realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. She drew a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of suffering, but also the spark of hope that had been growing since he had first knocked on her door. This was her chance to reclaim her life, and she would not let fear stop her. The escape continued, each step deliberate, each movement careful. The cowboy led her through hidden paths, avoiding roads and open areas where they might be seen. He had planned this meticulously, ensuring that every twist and turn kept them safe. She followed closely, matching his pace, learning to trust not only his guidance but her own instincts. Each step forward was a victory, each moment of silence a reassurance that they were one step closer to freedom. Then came the moment of confrontation. Her abuser, realizing that she was trying to escape, appeared suddenly in their path. He was angry, shouting, his face twisted with rage. For a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her, paralyzing her in place. But the cowboy stepped forward without hesitation, placing himself between her and danger. His calm authority contrasted sharply with the chaos of anger. "Stay back," he said firmly, his voice steady and commanding. She watched in awe as the man who had terrorized her for years was met with someone who would not be intimidated. The cowboy's presence was a shield, a barrier of protection that allowed her to move without fear. For the first time, she felt that someone could stand up for her in a way she never could on her own. Her abuser lunged, but the cowboy was prepared. He blocked the attempt, using strength and skill to keep her safe. She stood behind him, heart pounding, realizing that she was witnessing a turning point. The years of fear, the beatings, the abuse, they had led to this moment where she could finally step forward into safety. The confrontation did not last long, but it was decisive. Her abuser, frustrated and unable to regain control, finally retreated, leaving them standing together in the open air. The adrenaline from the confrontation lingered, but it was mixed with an overwhelming sense of relief. She had faced the immediate threat, and with the cowboy's help, she had survived. For the first time in years, she could breathe freely without the constant fear of sudden violence. The world seemed larger, brighter, full of possibilities she had not dared to imagine. They continued the journey, moving swiftly toward a safe place he had arranged. Along the way, he spoke gently, offering reassurance and guidance, reminding her to stay calm and focused. She followed his instructions, grateful for his knowledge and experience. Each step felt like a step toward reclaiming not just her freedom, but her life. As they traveled, she reflected on everything that had happened. The pain, the fear, the isolation. It all felt like a distant memory now, something that had shaped her but did not define her. She realized how strong she had become, how much courage it had taken to survive and how much she could endure. The journey was not over, but she knew she was no longer the same person who had been trapped behind those walls. Finally, they arrived at the safe location, a small, quiet home where no one would harm her. The cowboy helped her inside, ensuring that she was comfortable and secure. The fear that had been her constant companion began to ebb, replaced by a cautious hope. She realized that safety was not just the absence of danger, it was the presence of someone who cared, someone who could guide her through the uncertainty and help her rebuild her life. Sitting quietly in the new space, she let herself reflect on the journey. The escape had been terrifying, the confrontation intense, but she had made it. She had survived. And more importantly, she had discovered something she had forgotten existed: hope. The cowboy had shown her that kindness and courage could exist in the world, that someone could stand with her, and that she was not alone. The days that followed were filled with small steps toward healing. She rested, recovered, and began to feel the strength return to her body and spirit. The cowboy remained nearby, offering guidance when needed but never overstepping. He encouraged her to take things slowly, to trust in her own instincts, and to remember that she had survived 3 years of pain. She could survive this too. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant hues of orange and pink, she sat quietly, thinking about everything that had led her here. The fear, the abuse, the isolation. They had been real, painful, and unrelenting. But so was her courage, her determination, and now her hope. She realized that this journey was only the beginning of a new life, one where she could choose safety, happiness, and freedom. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to smile, to imagine a life without fear. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew she was not walking it alone. The cowboy had not just helped her escape. He had shown her that the world could be a place of kindness and support, and that she deserved to live fully, freely, and without fear. The first night in the safe house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. After 3 years of chaos, shouting, and fear, silence was strange, but not unwelcome. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft creak of the house settling and the distant sounds of the night outside. For the first time in years, she didn't flinch at every small noise. For the first time, she felt a sliver of peace. The cowboy had arranged everything carefully. The home was secure, with locks that worked and neighbors who would keep watch if needed. He stayed nearby but not too close, giving her space while ensuring she knew she was safe. There was no rush, no pressure, only patience and quiet reassurance. This, she realized, was the first step toward reclaiming her life, feeling safe enough to breathe without fear. The next morning she awoke to the smell of coffee and bread. The simple gesture filled her with warmth. The cowboy had prepared breakfast and left it in the kitchen, a note beside it, "Take your time. No one is in a hurry here." She smiled faintly, realizing how small acts of kindness had been missing from her life for so long, and how powerful they could be in helping her feel human again. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. For years she had eaten in fear, always bracing for the next outburst, the next punishment. Now, she could eat without flinching, without guilt, without fear. She realized that safety was not just about avoiding harm. It was about being able to live with dignity, to care for herself without constant threat. The cowboy returned later in the morning, carrying supplies for the day. He had arranged everything carefully, ensuring that she would have what she needed to start building a life outside the shadow of abuse. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle. Better," she said, though the word felt small compared to the enormity of what she was experiencing. Better didn't mean everything was perfect. It didn't mean the fear had vanished completely. But it did mean she could feel hope again, and that hope was a beginning. They spent the day doing simple tasks around the home, cleaning, organizing, and preparing for the days ahead. Each activity, though ordinary, felt significant. She realized she could make choices again, decisions about her environment, her life, and her routine. For years, every action had been dictated by fear, but now she was learning to act from her own will. In the quiet moments, she began to talk about her past, not the abusive details, but the memories she had once cherished, childhood joys, favorite places, dreams she had abandoned. Speaking about them aloud was healing, a way to reconnect with the parts of herself that had been buried under pain and fear. The cowboy listened patiently, never interrupting, never judging. His presence was a constant reminder that someone could care without demanding control. Over the following weeks, she began to explore new routines. She learned to walk outside without flinching, to look people in the eye, to speak without trembling. Small victories, like answering a simple question from a neighbor or stepping outside to feel the sun on her face, became monumental achievements. Each success, no matter how minor it seemed, was a step toward reclaiming her confidence. The cowboy continued to guide her gently, helping her develop skills that would allow her to be independent. He taught her how to handle finances, how to communicate clearly and assertively, and how to recognize situations that might be unsafe. Each lesson was empowering, giving her tools to take control of her life rather than being controlled by fear. One afternoon, she sat with a notebook, writing down her thoughts for the first time in years. She wrote about fear, about hope, about the journey she had endured. Writing became a form of therapy, a safe space where she could process emotions that had been bottled up for too long. She realized that expressing herself, whether through words, actions, or even silence, was an essential part of healing. The days grew brighter both literally and metaphorically. She began to laugh softly, almost hesitantly at first, but then more freely as comfort and trust grew. She realized she could feel joy again, and that joy did not diminish the pain she had endured. Instead, it coexisted with the scars she carried, a sign of resilience and strength. As her confidence grew, she started to think about the future. For the first time, she could imagine goals beyond mere survival. She thought about work, hobbies, and relationships she had once dreamt of but never dared to pursue. The world, which had seemed distant and threatening, now felt full of possibilities. She realized that her past, though painful, had not defined her future. The cowboy remained a steady presence, offering support without imposing control. It reminded her that healing was not linear, that some days would be harder than others, and that setbacks were part of the journey. His calm assurance helped her navigate moments of doubt, moments when fear threatened to resurface. With him nearby, she felt stronger, capable of facing challenges with resilience rather than panic. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, she stood outside and breathed deeply. The air was crisp, the world vibrant and alive. She realized she could feel the wind on her skin without fear. She could look at the horizon and imagine a future without chains. She could laugh, speak, and live. The freedom she had once only dreamed of was now tangible, present, and within her grasp. She began to reconnect with people she had lost contact with, carefully rebuilding relationships that had been strained or broken. She discovered that kindness existed in the world, that people could care without judgment, and that trust could be nurtured again. Each connection, each interaction, was a reminder that she was no longer alone, that her life could be full of support, friendship, and love. The cowboy helped her navigate practical matters too. Legal advice, safe housing arrangements, and personal safety plans became part of their routine. Though she had survived the immediate danger, he knew that long-term stability was essential for true healing. Together, they created a plan that balanced caution with empowerment, ensuring she could live safely while regaining independence. One morning, she looked in the mirror and saw herself fully for the first time in years. The woman staring back at her had eyes that reflected strength, courage, and resilience. The bruises were fading, but the scars, both visible and invisible, reminded her of the journey she had endured. She did not see a victim, she saw a survivor, a woman who had faced darkness and stepped into light. The days passed, each filled with growth and small victories. She explored hobbies she had once loved, rediscovered books and music that had brought her joy, and learned new skills that empowered her to take control of her life. Each activity, though simple, was a celebration of her autonomy and resilience. Through it all, she never forgot the role of the cowboy, the quiet man who had knocked on her door and changed the trajectory of her life. His kindness, patience, and steady presence had given her the courage to believe in safety, in trust, and in hope. She realized that sometimes all it takes is one person to remind you of your worth, to stand with you when the world seems against you. Finally, one evening, she stepped outside and looked at the horizon, the sun setting in brilliant colors. She felt a deep sense of peace, a realization that she was free not just from immediate danger, but from the fear that had dominated her life for years. She had survived, healed, and begun to rebuild a life filled with possibility, kindness, and hope. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly from her shoulders. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led her here, to safety, to strength, and to the realization that her life could belong to her once more. The scars she carried were not signs of weakness. They were marks of resilience, reminders that she had endured, survived, and thrived despite unimaginable hardship. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. The world was no longer a cage but a place of possibility. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. She had learned that hope could exist even in the darkest moments, and that kindness could come in the form of one person willing to stand by her side. As night fell, she sat quietly, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She knew that the road ahead would still have challenges, but she also knew she had the strength, the support, and the courage to face them. She had been beaten down, silenced, and controlled, but she had risen above it all. She had reclaimed her life, and nothing could take it from her now. The cowboy stood nearby, quietly observing, giving her space while remaining a steady presence. She smiled at him, a genuine smile that spoke of gratitude, relief, and hope. Words were not necessary. The connection between them, built on trust and care, said it all. He had been her guide, her protector, and her reminder that the world could be kind. In the quiet of the night, she felt a profound sense of empowerment. She was no longer the frightened woman trapped in a cycle of abuse. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a woman ready to embrace life fully. The past had shaped her, but it did not define her. The future was hers to write, filled with freedom, hope, and possibilities she had once only dreamed of. And as she looked toward that future, she realized that life could be beautiful again. She had endured the darkness, faced her fears, and discovered that courage, hope, and kindness could light the way forward. Her story, once a suffering, was now a story of survival, healing, and the incredible power of the human spirit.